Welcome back, everybody. We're getting into one of my favorite concepts, the examining objects or object groups inside of the Firepower operating system. I still remember when this concept was first introduced back in the ASAs and even before that. So I'm kind of dating myself in the whole history of the Firepower and before that ASA configuration when I go over some of the examples that I'm about to go over inside of object groups. The bottom line here with object groups is, in my opinion, it allows me to work smarter, not harder. It allows me to go through and define groups of objects. I don't mean to use the word to describe the word, but it allows me to create groups of objects that I use when I'm placing them inside of access control lists, NAT, VPN, various different policies that we talked about in our last topic. So what we're able to do here is either create it manually, which we're going to show you coming up in just one moment, or we can create it what is referred to as on demand. But one more time, it's very, very useful. I'm going to kind of go at this a little bit last with this subject dead last, but it's very, very useful for grouping objects together that need the same policy or will be used for the same reason. So once again, I can do, for example, source and destination addresses in a network object. Perhaps if I have myself an application that is using the same ports as a destination, I might feel that it's smarter to work with port objects. And tell you what, let me just stop there because we can all read some of these other objects. I'd rather give you a customer story real quick. I had a client where they were doing a growing number of RDP sessions into a growing number of actual servers. So very easily for almost 2 years, what we were doing is just manually saying, okay, we're going to add a new server. Okay, we're going to go in and we're going to manually add a new client. And then there was a day when the customer came to me and said, Isaac, I need you to add another 3 clients going into 6 more servers. And no, I'm not just making those numbers up. So had I approached this without doing object groups, which the end of the story is I ultimately re-engineered this to go to object groups. But if I had deployed this without taking the approach of object groups, I would have had to create at least 18 different rules in entries in my policies to be able to allow these 3 different clients into these 3 different servers. So as the story went, what I actually told the client said, hey, how long is it going to take to do this? And I mentioned, honestly, it's going to take maybe 15 minutes to do the config, push it, save it, test it. But Mr. Client, what I encourage that we do is re-architect this entire approach to use object groups. Because the bottom line is the original non-object group based approach, that is defining the source, defining the destination, defining the ports, all that was okay for them as they were a small deployment. But as they started to grow, it actually became more management to stick to the legacy approach. So again, I encourage the client, tell you what, just give me 4 hours, and what I'll do is I'm going to re-architect this access control policy to, instead of pointing to the individual addresses, the individual protocols, the individual ports, let me re-architect it to use object groups. And that story was actually a couple years ago. The client has been using object groups ever since, and they've been very, very happy. Now, speaking of history real quick, that was just that one client. Guys, when I tell you that I've been doing object groups for a solid 16 years, that's no exaggeration. Maybe even 17 years. I still remember my first deployment project. So again, this technology has been around for a very, very long time. All right, as I promised, I wanted to finish up with this one last because it might remind you of a subject that we talked about earlier in a multi-domain, aka multi-tenancy environment. You can use object groups to group objects for groupings of components that fall under a particular domain, or grouping of components that are going to be configured with specific attributes based upon the tenant, based upon the domain. So you've got yourself a lot of nice options here inside of and outside of a multi-domain environment. Now, speaking of multi-domain, by the way, this is another reason why I wanted to save multi-domain for last, is we get into another subject that falls under the multi-domain concept called object overrides. Folks, what you're able to do is define attributes or values on a global level, just as one example. And then with this override concept that we're talking about here, override that value at a lower level, at, if you remember from the last topic, where we were introducing multi-domains, you can have child domains under the global, and now again simply set an attribute or set a value at the global level, the global tenant, and folks, for all we know, that value may be adequate for 2 of the 3 child tenants. But what we can do here is go in and set a new value or override the object's value at the 3rd child tenant, again using this hierarchy to work smarter, not harder. So again, object overrides gives us the ability to use the hierarchy in a multi-tenant environment to redefine, or as the subject is saying, override a value at a lower child level. All right, finally, now that we're done with all the lecture, let's get into the GUI and show you how you actually do this. You might remember from earlier, there are 2 ways we can go in and create or manage our objects. One is literally in what's called the object manager. So I'm able to go in and manually create, define these objects. This is going to be great for people like me who are very, very neurotic, if you haven't noticed quite yet. And we know, hey, I know I'm going to use a bunch of source and destination addresses. I know I'm going to be using a bunch of services. And I'll go ahead and stop there because notice all the different options that we can do. Well, I can go in and create these first, and then over here when I'm under my add rule, I'm able to go in and choose these objects that are pre-created from these various tabs. Or, again, as neurotic as I might be, or some of us might be, we're not always going to be able to remember everything. So what we can also do is, as we're going in and adding the rule, so here it is again a second option, as they're referring to on-demand creation, as we're going in and adding a rule, let's say we wanted to identify a source address or a destination address, just as an example, and we say to ourselves, oh, darn it, I forgot to create this network object, or I forgot to go in and create this port object group. Again, guys, we can just click on that cute little green circle with the white plus inside of it and kick off another window to create the object at that, or excuse me, the object group at that time. So once again, really, really quick review over the topic of object groups. The concept has been around for a very, very long time. And it's, in my mind, I want to finish this subject the way I started. It literally is giving us the ability to work smarter, not harder, create a container of sorts, a grouping of objects, an object group, depending upon how you want to massage those words, but create a container of sorts for values that will be used together in policies for the same provisions and the same restrictions. Thank you guys very much for listening. See you soon.